You stabbed me.
Sir, you are charged with the murder of your wife and 2 sons, and the attempted murder of your daughter.
On the night of June 18, 2021, in a seemingly quiet suburban neighborhood of Miami, Florida, 42-year-old Jacob Miller stabbed his wife Sarah and their 2 sons, Timothy and Nathan, to death before inflicting non-fatal wounds on his 10-year-old daughter Emma and staging the scene as a home invasion. The horrific triple homicide shocked the coastal community, where neighbors described the Millers as a normal family who kept to themselves, giving no indication of the violence that would erupt behind closed doors. Blood-soaked evidence would later reveal that Jacob, a long-haul truck driver, had planned the murders of his entire family as part of an elaborate insurance scam, having recently taken out expanded policies on each family member. First responders described the scene at the Miller home as one of the most disturbing they had encountered, with the bodies of Sarah, Timothy, and Nathan bearing multiple stab wounds indicating a frenzied attack, while young Emma was found severely wounded but still clinging to life. Before we continue with this harrowing case, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Your support helps us continue to bring these important stories to light, ensuring that victims' voices are heard and justice is served. Jacob Miller's plan began to unravel almost immediately, despite his attempts to create a convincing crime scene by ransacking his own home and inflicting a superficial wound on himself to support his story of fighting off an intruder. According to investigators, Miller placed the frantic 911 call at 11:43 p.m., his voice breaking as he claimed an unknown assailant had attacked his family while he was in the garage, and that he had returned to find his wife and sons dead and his daughter gravely injured. Security camera footage from neighboring homes would later reveal no signs of any intruders entering or leaving the Miller property during the time frame of the murders, the first of many inconsistencies that would eventually expose Jacob's elaborate deception. The medical examiner's report would later conclude that Sarah Miller, 39, died from multiple stab wounds to the chest and neck, while Timothy, 14, and Nathan, 12, both suffered fatal wounds to their throats and torsos, suggesting they had been attacked while sleeping, giving them little chance to defend themselves. Emma Miller, just 10 years old at the time, survived despite sustaining several stab wounds to her abdomen and chest, with doctors later testifying that her survival was nothing short of miraculous. As paramedics rushed Emma to Miami Children's Hospital, Jacob Miller rode alongside her, maintaining his role as the devastated father whose family had been victimized by a random act of violence. What first responders noted, but initially attributed to trauma, was Emma's reluctance to look at her father in the ambulance, a subtle behavioral clue that would later take on profound significance as the investigation progressed. In the chaotic early hours following the attack, detectives from Miami-Dade Police Department began processing the blood-spattered scene, noting peculiarities that didn't align with Jacob's account of a home invasion gone wrong. Valuable electronics left untouched, no signs of forced entry, and blood spatter patterns inconsistent with Jacob's version of events. Jacob Miller presented himself as a grief-stricken husband and father, collapsing into tears during initial interviews with police and pleading for them to find whoever had destroyed his family. His performance was convincing enough that some officers initially felt sympathy for him, noting in their reports his apparent devastation and cooperation with their questioning. Behind the scenes, however, Detective Zachary Holland had already begun to harbor suspicions about Miller's account, noticing subtle inconsistencies in his story each time he retold it, and the staged appearance of the ransacked home, where valuables were disturbed but not taken. Blood evidence throughout the house told a story at odds with Jacob's claims, with cast-off patterns suggesting the attacker had moved methodically from room to room rather than engaging in a chaotic struggle with an intruder. The neighborhood, an upper-middle-class enclave of Miami, where violent crime was rare, had experienced no similar break-ins or home invasions in recent years, making the scenario Jacob described increasingly implausible to seasoned investigators. As dawn broke over Miami's skyline, casting long shadows across the Miller home now wrapped in police tape, Jacob Miller maintained his innocence while medical staff fought to save his daughter's life several miles away. Neighbors gathered in small clusters behind the police barricades, their faces etched with shock and disbelief as news spread of the horrific events that had unfolded on their street overnight. The vibrant, tourist-friendly image of Miami stood in stark contrast to the darkness that had descended on this particular corner of the city where 3 innocent lives had been violently extinguished. Sarah Miller's colleagues from the graphic design firm where she worked remotely would later describe their disbelief upon hearing the news, recalling how she had been on a video conference just hours before her death, excitedly discussing an upcoming family vacation to the Florida Keys. The brutal efficiency of Jacob Miller's attack left no chance for Sarah or the boys to call for help, with cell phone records showing Sarah's last text message had been to her sister about birthday plans for Emma the following month, a celebration the young girl would now face without her mother and brothers. The first 24 hours of the investigation revealed the careful planning that had preceded the murders, with detectives uncovering evidence that Jacob had researched home invasions and murder investigations in the weeks leading up to the killings. Digital forensic specialists would later recover deleted search histories from the family computer showing queries about knife wounds, blood evidence, and how police investigate staged crime scenes, all searched from an account logged in under Jacob's credentials. Neighbors reported seeing Jacob's truck parked in the driveway that evening, contradicting his claim that he had just returned home from a long haul when he discovered the alleged break-in, a discrepancy that raised immediate red flags for investigators, building a timeline of events. As the community reeled from the shocking violence, local news outlets began reporting on what was initially characterized as a tragic home invasion, with Jacob Miller portrayed as a devastated survivor. A narrative that would dramatically shift in the days to come, as Emma Miller awoke in her hospital bed and began to recall the events of that night. Miami's signature heat and humidity pressed down on the crime scene technicians as they meticulously documented every blood droplet, fingerprint, and piece of potential evidence throughout the Miller home. The family's story, as pieced together by neighbors and colleagues, painted a picture of normalcy that made the violence all the more incomprehensible. Sarah's successful work-from-home career as a graphic designer, Jacob's steady employment as a truck driver, the children's involvement in school and community activities. Financial records, however, would soon tell a different story, revealing mounting debt, missed mortgage payments, and significant life insurance policies recently taken out on all family members, with Jacob as the sole beneficiary. The juxtaposition of Miami's reputation as a playground for the wealthy with the Miller family's hidden financial struggles created a backdrop for the tragedy that would later help prosecutors establish motive for the brutal killings that had left 3 people dead and a young girl physically and emotionally scarred for life. As day turned to night on June 19th, Emma Miller regained consciousness in the pediatric intensive care unit, her small body connected to monitors and IV lines, with a police officer stationed outside her door. Her first words, according to the nurse on duty, were to ask about her mother and brothers, a question that no one was prepared to answer as medical staff exchanged pained glances, uncertain how to tell a 10-year-old girl that most of her family was gone forever. While Emma drifted in and out of consciousness, Detective Zachary Holland was building a case against Jacob Miller, piecing together financial records, digital evidence, and forensic findings that increasingly pointed to an elaborate insurance scheme as the motive behind the senseless killings. The stark contrast between Jacob's public persona as a hard-working family man and the emerging evidence of his cold-blooded plot highlighted the dual nature of Miami itself. A city of beautiful beaches and luxury hotels that also harbored dark secrets and desperate acts beneath its glittering surface. Jacob Miller spent that night in a hotel, ostensibly because his home was an active crime scene, but in reality because investigators wanted him separated from his daughter as she recovered. He made several calls to the hospital, presenting himself as a concerned father, desperate for updates on Emma's condition, while detectives monitored his movements and communications, waiting for him to make a mistake that would further incriminate him. Security footage from the hotel showed Miller pacing in his room late into the night, making multiple phone calls to his insurance company, behavior that struck investigators as oddly focused for a man who had supposedly just lost most of his family to a violent attack. As Miami slept, the investigation accelerated, with forensic analysts working through the night to process evidence from the Miller home, including the kitchen knife identified as the murder weapon, which bore only Jacob's fingerprints despite his claim that an intruder had used it. The city's shadowy underbelly of crime, usually associated with drug trafficking and corruption rather than family annihilation, provided a grim context for what prosecutors would later describe as one of the most calculating and heartless murders in Miami-Dade County's history. Sarah Miller was 39 years old when her life was cut short, a talented graphic designer who had built a successful freelance career that allowed her to work from home and be present for her 3 children. Friends described her as vibrant and dedicated, someone who balanced her professional ambitions with her commitment to family, often working late into the night after the children were asleep to meet client deadlines. Her portfolio showcased a distinctive style that had earned her loyal clients throughout Miami's competitive design industry, with colleagues noting her particular talent for branding small businesses that captured the city's unique cultural blend of Latin, Caribbean, and American influences. Sarah's sister would later testify that despite the outward appearance of a happy marriage, Sarah had confided increasing concerns about Jacob's mood swings and financial secretiveness in the months leading up to her murder, though she had never expressed fear for her physical safety. The Miller home in a middle-class neighborhood of Miami was filled with evidence of Sarah's creative touch. Walls adorned with her original artwork, custom-designed furniture that maximized their modest space, and carefully curated family photos documenting beach trips and birthday celebrations. Her workspace, a converted sunroom overlooking a small backyard where the children played, remained exactly as she had left it on the day of her death. A half-finished design on her computer screen, a cup of tea gone cold beside her keyboard, and a notepad filled with ideas for Timothy's upcoming science fair project. Sarah's mother would later tell the court that her daughter had been planning a surprise family vacation to celebrate Emma's upcoming birthday, having saved for months from her design projects to create special memories for her children, dreams violently shattered by her husband's betrayal. Friends from Sarah's college days at the University of Miami recalled her optimism and determination, qualities that had helped her build her business while raising 3 children, noting the cruel irony that the financial success she had achieved might have contributed to her husband's deadly insurance scheme. Timothy Miller, 14, was described by teachers as intellectually curious and kind, a high school freshman who excelled in science and had recently been selected for an advanced placement program. His bedroom, preserved as a crime scene, told the story of a typical teenage boy with unusual depth. Science fiction novels stacked beside his bed, a meticulously organized collection of marine specimens gathered from Miami's beaches, and a half-completed application for a summer marine biology program at the University of Miami. School friends recalled his quiet leadership and willingness to help struggling classmates, with his science teacher noting that Timothy had expressed interest in oceanography, inspired by growing up near Miami's coastal waters. The medical examiner would later testify that Timothy appeared to have awakened during the attack, with defensive wounds on his hands and arms suggesting he had tried to fight off his father in his final moments, a detail that visibly affected jurors during the trial. Nathan Miller, at 12 years old, was remembered as the family's athlete and comedian, a soccer player whose bedroom walls were covered with posters of his favorite Miami sports teams, and whose social media accounts were filled with videos of him practicing tricks with his soccer ball in the family's backyard. Unlike his older brother's academic focus, Nathan found his passion on the playing field, with coaches describing his natural talent and infectious enthusiasm that made him a team favorite despite being smaller than many of his teammates. Classmates recalled his protective nature toward Emma, walking her to her elementary school classroom each morning before heading to his own middle school campus, a routine that their mother had captured in photographs shared on social media with captions celebrating their sibling bond. The violent end to Nathan's young life left his soccer team devastated, with players and parents organizing a memorial tournament in his honor, commemorating a child whose energy and spirit had embodied the vibrant multicultural community of Miami where he had been raised. Emma Miller, the sole surviving victim of her father's attack, had just completed 4th grade at a local elementary school where teachers described her as creative and sensitive, with a particular talent for storytelling and art that echoed her mother's creative abilities. At just 10 years old, Emma had already accumulated a collection of writing awards and art contest ribbons displayed proudly on the bulletin board in her pink and teal bedroom that became part of the crime scene investigation. Friends and family noted Emma's especially close relationship with her mother, often accompanying Sarah to client meetings where she would quietly draw in her sketchbook, absorbing her mother's professional demeanor and creative process. The psychological trauma of surviving the attack that claimed her mother and brothers was compounded by the betrayal of her father, a man she had trusted and loved, creating wounds far deeper than the physical injuries that nearly claimed her life. Sarah's role as a work-from-home graphic designer had allowed her to create a warm, creative household where client meetings sometimes took place at the kitchen table, and the children grew up surrounded by art supplies and design discussions. Neighbors recalled seeing Sarah working on her laptop at her children's sporting events and school functions, multitasking to build her business while remaining present in her children's lives, embodying the work-life integration that many modern parents strive to achieve. Her client list included several prominent Miami businesses and cultural institutions, with her design work appearing on everything from restaurant menus in South Beach to promotional materials for events in the city's thriving arts district. Sarah's memorial service, held weeks after her death while Emma was still recovering in the hospital, drew hundreds of attendees from Miami's creative community, former classmates, and families from the children's schools, a testament to the lives she had touched through her work and parenting. The contrast between Sarah's transparent financial management of the household and Jacob's secretive handling of his trucking income would become a key point in the prosecution's case, with financial records revealing that Sarah had been the family's primary breadwinner in recent years as Jacob's long-haul trucking work became increasingly sporadic. Bank statements showed Sarah's consistent deposits from design clients alongside growing withdrawals by Jacob for unexplained expenses, creating financial strain that she had documented in increasingly concerned entries in her digital planner. What Sarah couldn't have known was that Jacob had been accumulating substantial gambling debts at several of Miami's nearby casino boats and offshore gambling establishments, losses he had hidden from his wife while becoming increasingly desperate for a financial solution. Friends noted that despite these hidden pressures, Sarah had maintained an optimistic outlook, telling colleagues just days before her murder that she had secured several new clients and was planning to expand her business in the coming year. Plans that revealed her hope for a future that Jacob had already decided to violently terminate. Timothy's academic achievements and Nathan's athletic abilities represented the culmination of Sarah's dedicated parenting and the opportunities she had worked to provide despite the family's financial challenges. School records showed both boys thriving in their respective areas of interest, with Timothy's science projects winning regional competitions and Nathan being scouted for competitive travel soccer teams that could have eventually led to college scholarships. The brothers shared a bedroom in the family's modest home, their different personalities evident in the clear division between Timothy's meticulously organized desk and bookshelves and Nathan's chaotic collection of sports equipment and trophies. The boys' teachers would later describe to the court their shock at learning of the murders, emphasizing how normal and well-adjusted both Timothy and Nathan had appeared in school, with no signs of the family dysfunction that might have foreshadowed such violence. In death, the brothers were buried side by side in a Miami cemetery overlooking Biscayne Bay, their shared headstone engraved with a quote from Sarah's favorite poem about the enduring nature of love, a final tribute arranged by Sarah's parents, who would later become Emma's guardians. Emma's survival would be described by medical professionals as nothing short of miraculous, with the surgeon who performed her emergency operation testifying that one of the stab wounds had missed her heart by less than an inch. Physical therapists who worked with her during her recovery noted her determination to regain strength, viewing each milestone, sitting up, walking, eventually returning to drawing, as a victory not just for herself, but in honor of her mother and brothers. Child psychologists who treated Emma following the attack documented her journey from confusion and denial to the devastating realization that her father had been responsible for destroying their family, a process complicated by her lingering love for him despite his betrayal. Emma's artwork from therapy sessions, later shown to the jury with the permission of her grandparents, revealed the psychological impact of the trauma. Early drawings showing her complete family still together, gradually giving way to darker images that depicted her understanding of what had actually occurred on the night of June 18th. The Miller family had been, by most outward appearances, living the Miami middle-class dream, a modest but comfortable home in a safe neighborhood, children involved in school and activities, parents with stable careers. Holiday cards sent the previous December showed smiling faces against the backdrop of a local beach, the Miami skyline visible in the distance, an image that would be repurposed by news outlets as the case unfolded, often shown split-screen with Jacob's mugshot in a visual representation of the facade versus the reality of the Miller family dynamics. What wasn't visible in those smiling photos was Jacob's mounting desperation as his gambling debts accumulated at the same time that his trucking routes became less frequent, creating a financial pressure cooker that he ultimately decided to relieve through the most unthinkable of solutions. The family's story, unfolding against the backdrop of Miami's reputation as a playground for the wealthy, highlighted the dark reality that sometimes lurked behind the city's glossy facade, where financial pressures and secret addictions could push a seemingly normal father to commit the ultimate betrayal of those who loved and trusted him most. The 911 call came in at 11:43 p.m. on June 18, 2021, with Jacob Miller's voice breaking as he frantically reported a home invasion that had left multiple family members injured or worse. "Someone broke in. There's blood everywhere. My wife, my kids, please hurry," he pleaded with the dispatcher, his performance so convincing that the operator later stated she had no reason to doubt the genuine distress in his voice. Miami-Dade Police Department officers arrived at the Miller residence within 7 minutes, finding Jacob outside the front door with a superficial cut on his arm, appearing distraught and disoriented as he directed them inside the single-story home where the true horror awaited. First responders described a scene of extreme violence. Sarah Miller's body in the master bedroom, the boys in their shared room, and young Emma, barely conscious but still breathing, on the floor of her bedroom with multiple stab wounds to her chest and abdomen, all while Jacob continued his performance as the devastated husband and father who had supposedly interrupted an intruder. Detective Zachary Holland, a 15-year veteran of Miami-Dade's Homicide Division with experience investigating the city's most violent crimes, arrived at the scene within the hour, immediately noticing details that didn't align with typical home invasions he had investigated throughout his career in Miami. The ransacking looked performative rather than the result of a genuine search for valuables, he would later testify, pointing to how electronics, cash, and jewelry were disturbed but not taken, and how drawers were pulled out and emptied in ways that suggested someone trying to create the appearance of a robbery rather than actually conducting one. Holland also noted the lack of forced entry, with no signs of tampering on any doors or windows, despite Jacob's claim that he had found the back door ajar after hearing commotion from the garage where he claimed to have been working on his truck. As Emma was rushed to Miami Children's Hospital by paramedics, Holland began his initial assessment of the scene, instructing officers to establish a wide perimeter around the property, while crime scene technicians documented every detail of what would soon be recognized as a staged crime scene. Jacob Miller's behavior during those first critical hours struck some officers as inconsistent with typical reactions to family trauma, with his questions focusing more on what police had found and whether they had any leads, rather than on Emma's condition or expressing grief over his wife and sons. Holland's trained eye caught Jacob repeatedly, glancing at the kitchen knife set from which the murder weapon had been taken, now marked as evidence on the counter, his gaze returning to it multiple times during the initial questioning conducted in the family's living room. He kept looking at the knife block, then checking our reactions, a behavior that immediately raised flags for me, Holland would later explain to the court, describing how Jacob's demeanor shifted between performative grief when directly engaged and a calculating alertness when he thought he wasn't being observed. Body camera footage from the first responding officers captured these behavioral inconsistencies, including moments when Jacob appeared to be monitoring the officers' movements throughout the house, rather than displaying the disoriented shock typical of genuine trauma victims. The most critical evidence during those initial hours came not from the physical crime scene, but from Emma Miller herself, who regained consciousness briefly in the ambulance and again in the emergency room, where medical staff reported her unusual reactions to her father's presence. A trauma nurse documented how Emma flinched away when Jacob attempted to hold her hand, turning her face toward the wall despite her injuries, behavior initially attributed to pain and confusion, but which later took on profound significance. She kept asking where her mom was, but never looked directly at her father, even though he was right beside her, noted Dr. Melissa Sandoval, the pediatric trauma surgeon who performed the emergency surgery that saved Emma's life. During brief moments of consciousness between emergency treatments, Emma's vital signs showed marked elevation whenever Jacob entered her room, a physiological response that medical professionals flagged to Detective Holland as potentially significant given the circumstances of the case. While Emma fought for her life in surgery, crime scene technicians at the Miller home made a crucial discovery that contradicted Jacob's version of events. Blood spatter analysis revealed patterns inconsistent with his claim of interrupting an attack in progress. The directional blood spatter and cast-off patterns indicated that the perpetrator moved methodically from room to room, with no evidence of the chaotic struggle Mr. Miller described having with an intruder, testified blood spatter analyst Carlos Vega. The murder weapon, a kitchen knife from the Miller's own set, bore only Jacob's fingerprints and those of Sarah, who had likely used it earlier that day for food preparation, with no unidentified prints that might suggest an outside attacker. Security camera footage obtained from neighbors showed no unusual vehicles or individuals approaching the Miller home during the time frame of the murders, with the only movement being Jacob's own truck arriving home several hours earlier than he had claimed in his initial statement to police. Miami-Dade medical examiner Dr. Eliana Fernandez arrived at the scene shortly after midnight, conducting preliminary examinations of Sarah, Timothy, and Nathan's bodies before they were transported to the morgue for full autopsies. Her initial findings, documented in contemporaneous notes later presented as evidence, immediately contradicted Jacob's timeline, with liver temperature and livor mortis indicating that the deaths had occurred between 9 WAUS p.m. and 10:30 p.m., at least an hour before Jacob placed his 911 call. The pattern and angle of the wounds suggested a right-handed attacker of above-average height, consistent with Mr. Miller's physical attributes, Dr. Fernandez would later testify, noting that the depth and force of the wounds indicated significant upper body strength rather than the frenzied attack of a panicked intruder. Sarah's defensive wounds told a particularly heartbreaking story, with cuts on her hands and forearms suggesting she had awoken and attempted to fight off her attacker, likely recognizing her husband in her final moments of consciousness. As dawn broke over Miami on June 19th, the investigation had already begun to focus on Jacob Miller rather than the phantom intruder he had described, though detectives maintained the pretense of searching for an outside perpetrator while building their case. Holland assigned officers to canvass the neighborhood and review security footage from nearby homes and businesses, while simultaneously requesting Jacob's phone records, financial documents, and internet search history. "We approached it as a two-track investigation," Holland explained during the trial, following protocols for a home invasion while simultaneously exploring the possibility that Mr. Miller had staged the scene to cover his own actions. This strategy allowed investigators to gather crucial evidence while Jacob still believed his performance was convincing, including surveillance footage from a gas station showing him purchasing gloves similar to those later found hidden in his truck and blood-stained boots discovered in the garage that Jacob claimed he hadn't worn in weeks. The most damning early evidence came from the family computer, where digital forensic specialists recovered deleted searches from the weeks preceding the murders, all conducted while logged into Jacob's account. Life insurance payout murder investigation, how to make murder look like robbery, and knife wounds fatal versus non-fatal. These searches, combined with recently increased life insurance policies on Sarah and all three children, quickly established a financial motive that would become central to the prosecution's case. Miami-Dade has seen its share of financially motivated murders over the years, but the calculated nature of these searches followed by the brutal execution of his family placed this case in a category of its own, State Attorney Madison Jenkins would later tell the press. Financial investigators discovered that Jacob had accumulated gambling debts exceeding $150,000 at various casinos within driving distance of Miami, debts that were coming due just as the life insurance policies on his family members reached the end of their contestability periods. While the forensic investigation proceeded, Detective Holland maintained regular contact with the medical team treating Emma, receiving updates on her condition and waiting for an opportunity to speak with the only surviving witness to the attack. After 36 hours of critical care, including emergency surgery to repair damaged organs, Emma stabilized enough for brief periods of questioning with a child psychiatrist present to minimize additional trauma. Holland entered her hospital room to find a small, pale figure connected to multiple medical devices, her eyes reflecting a wariness beyond her years as she regarded the detective and the child psychiatrist who had been assigned to her case. "I have to ask you some questions about what happened at your house," Holland began gently, establishing rapport by first talking about Emma's favorite art projects that her grandmother had mentioned. Emma's initial responses were guarded and confused, with fragments of memory emerging about a shadow in my room and Daddy yelling about someone breaking in, narratives that aligned with Jacob's version of events but which the psychiatrist noted seemed rehearsed rather than recalled. The breakthrough in the case came not through forensic evidence or digital records, but through Emma's own evolving narrative, as she began to feel safe with the consistent presence of the medical team and her maternal grandparents, who had flown in from Chicago to be at her bedside. During a follow-up interview 3 days after the attack, with Jacob deliberately kept away from the hospital on the pretense of assisting with the investigation, Emma's story began to change in subtle but significant ways. She began asking if her dad was angry with her, if she was in trouble for not saying the right things, recalled Dr. Sophia Martinez, the child psychiatrist who attended all interviews with Emma. This shift in Emma's concerns, from the supposed intruder to her father's reaction to her statements, signaled to investigators that the child was beginning to process the reality of what she had witnessed, and her role in maintaining or breaking her father's fabricated narrative. 5 days after the murders, as Emma Miller's physical condition stabilized enough for extended periods of consciousness, Detective Zachary Holland arranged for a specialized child forensic interviewer to work with her alongside Dr. Martinez. The interview room at Miami Children's Hospital had been carefully prepared to feel non-threatening, with drawing materials available and a therapy dog named Luna Present to provide comfort to the traumatized child. We created an environment where Emma could feel safe expressing what she had experienced, using techniques developed specifically for traumatized children who may be reluctant to implicate a parent, explained Vanessa Torres, the forensic interviewer with Miami-Dade's Crimes Against Children unit. Emma's initial drawings showed her family home with dark shadows throughout and a faceless figure in what appeared to be her parents' bedroom, imagery that Dr. Martinez noted was consistent with a child processing traumatic memories through symbolic representation rather than direct narrative. The breakthrough came when Emma was asked to draw where everyone was when the bad thing happened, resulting in a picture that showed her father in her brother's room holding what appeared to be a knife, a critical divergence from Jacob's claim of being in the garage when the attack began. When gently questioned about this drawing, Emma fell silent for several long minutes before whispering, "Daddy said I have to say it was a bad man, or else I'd be in trouble too." The weight of this statement reverberated through the interview room, captured on video that would later be presented to the grand jury and ultimately to the trial jury. Emma then described, in the fragmented way typical of traumatized children, awakening to see her father entering her bedroom with the big kitchen knife after hearing strange noises from her brother's room across the hall. He looked scary, not like Daddy, she recalled, demonstrating through a role play with dolls how she had pulled her covers up and pretended to be asleep, only to feel sudden, sharp pain as the knife struck her chest and abdomen. According to Emma's account, Jacob had then left her room abruptly after she cried out, returning minutes later in a seemingly different state, now playing the role of concerned father who had found her injured. This pivotal interview represented a turning point in both the investigation and in Emma's psychological processing of the trauma, with Dr. Martinez noting she was beginning to integrate the reality that the person she loved and trusted most had tried to kill her, a cognitive dissonance almost unbearable for a child her age. While Emma rested after the emotionally exhausting interview, Holland convened an urgent meeting with the state attorney's office, presenting the video testimony alongside the forensic evidence that had been accumulated over the previous 5 days. State Attorney Madison Jenkins, known throughout Miami's legal community for her methodical approach to building cases, authorized a surveillance operation on Jacob Miller while her office prepared arrest warrants. "We needed to ensure Emma's continued safety while building an airtight case," Jenkins later explained, noting that the unique challenges of prosecuting a case where the primary witness was a traumatized child required extraordinary care in evidence collection and witness preparation. Jacob Miller, unaware that his daughter had begun to reveal the truth, continued his performance as the grieving husband and father, giving tearful interviews to local Miami news outlets about the supposed home invasion that had destroyed his family. His public appeals for information about the intruder created a surreal spectacle for the investigators who were now monitoring his every move, watching as he laid flowers at the hospital entrance for news cameras, while being barred from actually visiting Emma due to the ongoing investigation. His behavior followed the classic pattern we see in family annihilators who fail to complete their plan, noted FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Rebecca Chen, who was consulted on the case. When the narrative they've constructed begins to crumble, they double down on their public performance, often seeking media attention to reinforce their version of events while attempting to gauge how much authorities actually know. The investigation accelerated as search warrants yielded additional evidence from Jacob's truck and his personal storage unit in a facility near Miami International Airport. Hidden in a compartment beneath the truck's sleeper cabin, forensic technicians discovered a plastic bag containing the clothes Jacob had worn during the murders, still stained with blood, later matched to Sarah, Timothy, and Nathan. The presence of high-velocity blood spatter on these clothes directly contradicted Mr. Miller's claim that he only entered the home after the attacks had occurred, explained forensic scientist Gabriela Diaz. The storage unit contained financial documents revealing the extent of Jacob's gambling debts at casinos throughout South Florida and the Caribbean, along with recently increased life insurance policies on each family member, with combined payouts exceeding $3 million in the event of accidental death. Most damning was a notebook detailing what prosecutors would later describe as Jacob's murder checklist, with entries including "make sure Emma doesn't wake up," and "wait 45-60 mile before calling 911. As this evidence accumulated, Emma's recovery continued under the watchful eyes of both medical staff and police protection, with her maternal grandparents, Robert and Patricia Gardner, maintaining a constant presence at her bedside. During a routine check of Emma's vital signs, 7 days after the attack, a nurse reported that the child became severely agitated when a tall male hospital worker resembling Jacob briefly entered her room, triggering what Dr. Martinez identified as a post-traumatic stress response. Her heart rate doubled, she began hyperventilating, and she tried to hide under her blankets, all classic signs of re-experiencing trauma, the psychiatrist documented. This incident prompted another session with the forensic interviewer, during which Emma revealed more details about the night of the murders, including hearing her mother scream shortly before her father appeared in her doorway and seeing blood already on his hands and clothing before he attacked her. The most critical revelation came during a supervised phone call that investigators arranged between Emma and Jacob, designed to gather potential evidence while ensuring Emma's psychological safety through careful preparation and immediate support. With Emma's grandparents and Dr. Martinez present, along with detectives monitoring the call, Jacob asked his daughter if she remembered what we talked about regarding what she should tell the police. Unaware that Emma had already begun to disclose the truth, Jacob made statements that prosecutors would later characterize as witness tampering, telling Emma, "Remember, you were asleep and didn't see anything until I woke you up after finding you hurt," Emma, coached by her support team to respond naturally, without confrontation, remained mostly silent during the call, but when Jacob told her he would be there soon to take care of her, her response sent shockwaves through the investigation team. "You hurt me, Daddy. You hurt Mommy and Timmy and Nathan." The stunned silence that followed this statement was broken by Jacob's unconvincing attempt to reframe her words. "No, sweetheart, the bad man hurt all of you. Daddy tried to save you." Emma's response, delivered with the heartbreaking clarity that sometimes emerges through childhood trauma, became the title of the case that would dominate Miami's news cycle for the next year. "You stabbed me." Detective Holland, listening to the call alongside State Attorney Jenkins, described this moment as the dam-breaking, with Emma's 4 words cutting through the elaborate deception Jacob had constructed. Jacob ended the call abruptly, claiming he was getting another call, unaware that his reaction had been documented and would later be presented to the jury as consciousness of guilt. Within hours of this call, surveillance teams observed Jacob withdrawing large sums of cash from multiple ATMs across Miami and researching flights to countries without U.S. extradition treaties, behaviors that accelerated the timeline for his arrest. Emma's disclosure and Jacob's subsequent actions created urgency within the investigation team, with Detective Holland securing emergency arrest warrants based on the accumulated evidence and the clear flight risk Jacob now presented. We had to move quickly to prevent him from fleeing the jurisdiction while ensuring we had enough evidence for the state attorney to pursue maximum charges, Holland explained. The arrest strategy was complicated by Miami's busy tourist season, with Jacob's last known location being a crowded hotel in South Beach, where apprehending him without incident required careful planning to ensure public safety. Miami-Dade's tactical operations team coordinated with hotel security to determine when Jacob returned to his room, executing the arrest warrant at 11:17 p.m. on June 25th. Exactly 1 week after the murders, as he was packing a suitcase containing cash, false identification, and printouts of flight information to Venezuela. Jacob Miller's arrest became breaking news across Miami, with local stations interrupting regular programming to broadcast footage of him being escorted in handcuffs from the upscale South Beach Hotel, his previous media-friendly demeanor replaced by a stone-faced silence as he ducked into the police vehicle. The charges were announced at a press conference the following morning: 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of attempted first-degree murder, and additional charges related to insurance fraud, witness tampering, and obstruction of justice. State Attorney Madison Jenkins, standing before the assembled Miami press corps with the city's iconic skyline visible through the windows behind her, characterized the case as one of the most calculated and heartless crimes in Miami-Dade's history, emphasizing that her office would be seeking the death penalty based on the particularly heinous nature of the murders and the special circumstances of killing for financial gain. Meanwhile, Emma Miller remained in the hospital, physically recovering from her wounds, but facing a lifetime of psychological healing ahead. News of her father's arrest reached her through her grandparents and Dr. Martinez, who had carefully prepared her for this development. Her immediate reaction was a complex mixture of relief and grief, Dr. Martinez noted in her case files. She asked if her daddy was going away forever, and then began to cry, not for her own safety, but expressing guilt that she had gotten him in trouble by telling the truth. This reaction, typical of children who have suffered abuse or trauma at the hands of a parent, underscored the psychological complexity of the case and the extraordinary courage it had taken for a 10-year-old girl to ultimately reveal that her father, rather than a mysterious intruder, had destroyed their family in a single night of calculated violence. In the weeks following Jacob Miller's arrest, the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office assembled a formidable case built upon 3 pillars: forensic evidence, financial documentation, and Emma's testimony. Prosecutor Madison Jenkins, a veteran of high-profile murder cases throughout South Florida, assembled a specialized team that included financial crimes experts, child trauma specialists, and the county's most experienced homicide prosecutors. The complexity of this case required us to approach it from multiple angles simultaneously, Jenkins explained during pre-trial proceedings, noting that beyond proving Jacob had committed the physical acts of violence, they needed to establish the calculated nature of his plan to murder his entire family for insurance money. Forensic analysis of blood evidence throughout the Miller home contradicted Jacob's account of interrupting an attack in progress, with blood spatter patterns indicating that the perpetrator moved methodically from room to room, beginning with Sarah in the master bedroom, then the boys in their shared room, and finally Emma in her separate bedroom, a sequence that matched Emma's fragmented recollections of hearing her mother's screams, followed by unusual sounds from her brother's room before her father appeared in her doorway. The kitchen knife recovered at the scene bore only Jacob and Sarah's fingerprints, with the blood of all 4 victims present on the blade and handle in a pattern consistent with a single attacker using the same weapon throughout the house. The blood evidence tells us that Mr. Miller never changed or cleaned the knife between attacks, suggesting a rapid, determined sequence of violence rather than the chaotic struggle he described with an intruder, testified blood spatter analyst Carlos Vega. Microscopic examination of Jacob's superficial arm wound, which he claimed resulted from fighting off the attacker, revealed characteristics consistent with self-infliction: shallow, hesitant cuts of uniform depth, typical of wounds people inflict on themselves rather than the variable, defensive wounds sustained in genuine struggles. The timeline established by the medical examiner placed the attacks between 9:30 p.m. and 10:30 p.m., contradicting Jacob's claim that he discovered the scene shortly before his 11:43 p.m. 911 call, and supporting the prosecution's contention that he had used the intervening time to stage the home invasion scene. Financial investigators uncovered a motive as old as crime itself: money, specifically the $3.2 million in combined life insurance that Jacob stood to collect upon the deaths of his wife and children. Mr. Miller's financial activities in the months preceding the murders paint a picture of a man drowning in gambling debt and seeking a catastrophic solution, testified financial crimes investigator Rafael Moreno. Bank records revealed that Jacob had taken out or increased life insurance policies on all family members within the previous year, with policy documents recovered from his storage unit showing he had specifically selected options that would pay double for deaths resulting from violent crime. Further investigation into Jacob's trucking income showed a pattern of declining work over the previous 2 years, with his routes becoming less frequent while his gambling losses at various establishments throughout South Florida steadily increased. Records from the Miccosukee Resort and Gaming Complex west of Miami, along with several offshore gambling boats that operated from Miami's ports, documented Jacob's losses exceeding $230,000 over an 18-month period, far more than his reported income from trucking during the same time frame. Loan sharks operating in Miami's shadowy gambling underworld had begun threatening Jacob, with text messages recovered from his phone showing increasingly desperate communications about payment deadlines in the weeks leading up to the murders. The financial pressure cooker Mr. Miller had created for himself was about to explode, Prosecutor Jenkins told the grand jury, presenting evidence that Jacob had maxed out multiple credit cards, taken a second mortgage on the family home without Sarah's knowledge, and even stolen money from his children's modest college savings accounts established by their grandparents. The digital forensic evidence proved particularly damning, with Jacob's internet search history revealing a methodical research process leading up to the murders. Searches conducted on the family computer while logged into Jacob's account included phrases such as "how to stage crime scene," "knife wounds fatal versus non-fatal," and how long before life insurance pays for murder, with timestamps showing these queries occurring primarily when Sarah and the children were out of the house. His phone's location data contradicted his claim of having been on a long-haul trucking route in the days before the murders, instead placing him at Miami area libraries, where he used public computers to research topics including Families Killed Home Invasion Miami and how police investigate staged crime scenes. Searches, he apparently believed, couldn't be traced back to him, but which were captured on library security cameras and later linked to his library card usage. As the case against Jacob Miller grew stronger, Emma continued her physical and psychological recovery, now living with her maternal grandparents in a quiet suburb north of Miami, where the press had been asked to respect her privacy. Child psychologist Dr. Sofia Martinez worked with Emma 3 times weekly using specialized trauma-informed therapy techniques to help the child process the violent loss of her mother and brothers and the betrayal by her father. Emma's healing process is complicated by the dual trauma of nearly losing her life and discovering that the person she trusted most was responsible, Dr. Martinez explained in court documents requesting special accommodations for Emma's eventual testimony. The psychological assessment noted that Emma experienced nightmares, flashbacks, and anxiety symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, but was showing remarkable resilience through art therapy and play-based interventions designed for children who have experienced extreme trauma. In preparation for trial, prosecutors worked closely with Dr. Martinez and forensic interviewer Vanessa Torres to determine how best to obtain Emma's testimony while minimizing additional trauma to the already suffering child. Our dual responsibility was to build a case that would bring justice for Sarah, Timothy, and Nathan, while also protecting Emma from further harm during the legal process, explained Jenkins. The solution, approved by the presiding judge over defense objections, involved recording Emma's testimony in advance in a comfortable setting with only essential personnel present to be played for the jury during trial rather than requiring her to face her father in the courtroom. This testimony, taken 8 months after the murders when Emma had physically recovered and made significant progress in therapy, provided the emotional core of the prosecution's case while sparing her the additional trauma of testifying in person. In her recorded testimony, Emma described waking to strange sounds on the night of June 18th, followed by her father entering her room with a knife already covered in blood. His face looked different, scary, she explained, demonstrating with a drawing how he had approached her bed while she pretended to still be asleep. With remarkable composure for a child her age, Emma recounted feeling sharp pain in her chest and stomach, followed by her father leaving the room only to return minutes later in what she described as his normal daddy voice, now claiming to have discovered her injured. Most devastating was her explanation of why she initially supported Jacob's intruder story. Daddy told me in the ambulance that I had to say it was a bad man who hurt everyone, or else they would take me away forever, and I'd never see him again. This manipulation of a wounded, terrified child became one of the most emotionally impactful elements of the state's case, highlighting the calculated nature of Jacob's actions, not just in planning the murders, but in his immediate efforts to create an accomplice of his own traumatized daughter. As the trial date approached, the defense team faced the overwhelming challenge of countering not just the forensic and financial evidence, but also the powerful testimony of Emma herself. Jacob's court-appointed attorneys initially pursued a strategy suggesting that Emma's trauma had created false memories, bringing in their own child psychology experts to testify about the malleability of children's recollections following traumatic events. This approach backfired dramatically when prosecutors presented the evolution of Emma's disclosures, from her initial adherence to Jacob's story to her gradual revelation of the truth as she felt safe enough to speak. A progression that child trauma experts testified was entirely consistent with a child protecting a parent out of fear and misplaced loyalty, rather than confusion about what had actually occurred. The final component of the prosecution's case addressed the question of why Jacob had failed to kill Emma despite clearly intending to murder his entire family. The evidence suggests that after stabbing Emma, Jacob Miller was interrupted by a phone call from a neighbor who had planned to drop off borrowed garden tools that evening, Detective Holland testified, presenting phone records showing a call to the Miller home at approximately 10:15 p.m. This unexpected communication, coming just after Jacob had attacked Emma, but before he could ensure she was dead, likely forced him to abandon his original plan and hastily begin staging the home invasion scenario instead. In essence, a coincidental phone call saved Emma Miller's life, creating the sole witness to a crime that Jacob Miller had meticulously planned to leave no survivors, Holland concluded, a statement that sent visible ripples of reaction through the gallery of Miami community members who had been following the case through extensive local media coverage. The defense, increasingly desperate as pre-trial motions were systematically denied by Judge Ramirez, attempted to have Emma's testimony excluded on grounds that the child had been coached by investigators and therapists, a claim vehemently rejected by the court after review of the comprehensive documentation of all interactions with Emma following the attacks. The record clearly shows appropriate forensic interviewing techniques were used throughout, with no evidence of suggestion or coaching, ruled Judge Ramirez, noting that the progression of Emma's disclosures followed established patterns typical of traumatized children, gradually revealing abuse or violence perpetrated by a trusted caregiver. With their attempts to exclude the central elements of the state's case failing, Jacob's defense team began exploring plea negotiations, approaching prosecutors with offers to plead guilty in exchange for removing the death penalty from consideration, offers that Madison Jenkins, after consultation with Sarah's parents and consideration of the heinous nature of the crimes, firmly rejected. As the case proceeded toward trial in the Miami-Dade County Courthouse, media attention intensified, with national news organizations joining local coverage of what had become known throughout Florida as the Emma Miller case, a name that focused on the sole survivor rather than the perpetrator, a framing that Jenkins had carefully cultivated in her public statements about the case. The city of Miami, accustomed to sensational crime stories involving drug trafficking, corruption, and occasional celebrity misconduct, found itself gripped by the pure domestic horror of a father's betrayal of his entire family for financial gain. Community groups organized vigils for Sarah, Timothy, and Nathan, while a local artist collective created a public mural near Emma's elementary school, depicting 3 butterflies rising above storm clouds, a memorial that deliberately avoided imagery that might further traumatize Emma or other children, but which became a gathering place for the community to process the tragedy that had occurred in their midst. Jacob Miller's arrest at the South Beach Hotel on June 25, 2021, marked the beginning of a new phase in the investigation, as Miami-Dade detectives now had the opportunity to interrogate their primary suspect directly. Transported to police headquarters in downtown Miami, Miller was placed in an interview room specifically designed for high-profile cases, equipped with multiple camera angles to document every facial expression and gesture. We wanted to ensure that nothing was missed during what we anticipated would be a critical interrogation, explained Detective Zachary Holland, who led the questioning alongside his partner, Detective Maria Santos. The recorded interrogation, later played in its entirety for the jury, began with Jacob still maintaining his innocence, tearfully asking about Emma's condition, and inquiring whether police had any leads on the intruder he claimed had attacked his family. This performance continued for nearly 40 minutes as detectives allowed him to elaborate on his version of events, documenting each detail that would later be systematically dismantled by forensic evidence and Emma's testimony. The tone of the interrogation shifted dramatically when Holland placed photographs of Jacob's blood-stained clothes recovered from his truck on the table between them. "Would you like to explain why these were hidden in a compartment in your truck rather than turned over to investigators?" Holland asked, his voice remaining calm, while Jacob's demeanor visibly changed from grief-stricken father to cornered suspect. Jacob initially claimed he had no knowledge of the clothes, suggesting they had been planted by the real killer, a response that Detective Santos countered by revealing the DNA results already obtained from expedited testing. The blood on these clothes belongs to Sarah, Timothy, Nathan, and Emma, and the only fingerprints inside that hidden compartment are yours, Mr. Miller. The interview room fell silent as Jacob stared at the photographs, his previous emotional displays suddenly absent as he calculated his limited remaining options. When presented with Emma's initial statement that contradicted his intruder story, Jacob attempted to undermine his own daughter's credibility, suggesting she was confused from the trauma and saying what she thinks people want to hear, a strategy that prosecutors would later characterize as particularly callous given his manipulation of Emma's trust and loyalty in the immediate aftermath of the attacks. The most damning moment of the interrogation came when detectives played a recording of the phone call in which Emma had directly accused him. "You stabbed me." Jacob's reaction, captured in high-definition video, showed a momentary flash of rage, quickly masked by manufactured confusion, followed by an unconvincing performance of a concerned father worried about his daughter's mental state. That reaction told us everything we needed to know. Holland later testified it wasn't the response of an innocent man wrongly accused. It was the reaction of someone seeing their carefully constructed narrative collapsing. After nearly 6 hours of questioning, with Jacob's story becoming increasingly convoluted as detectives methodically presented evidence contradicting each element of his account, Holland directly confronted him with the financial evidence: the gambling debts, the maxed-out credit cards, the increased life insurance policies, and the searches about insurance payouts for murder victims. "We know why you did it, Jacob," Holland said, sliding the financial documents across the table. "The only question remaining is whether you're going to take responsibility or continue to make your daughter relive this trauma through a trial." This strategic framing, appealing to what little might remain of Jacob's paternal instinct, was designed to offer him a narrative in which confession could be positioned as finally doing something to protect Emma after having failed her so catastrophically. Jacob Miller's response to this direct confrontation revealed the calculating nature that had driven the murders, as he immediately asked about potential plea agreements and sentencing, rather than continuing to proclaim innocence or showing remorse for his actions. "I think I should talk to a lawyer now," he stated flatly, the first legally savvy decision he had made since beginning his ill-conceived plan to murder his family for insurance money. Detectives Holland and Santos concluded the interrogation, having secured significant evidence of consciousness of guilt through Jacob's reactions and inconsistent statements, even without obtaining a confession. "Sometimes what suspects don't say is as important as what they do say," Holland explained during trial testimony, highlighting how Jacob had never once asked for details about how Sarah and the boys had died, showing no emotional reaction to the crime scene photos placed before him, unnatural responses for a truly grieving husband and father. Following the interrogation, Jacob was processed into the Miami-Dade County Pre-Trial Detention Center, the imposing concrete facility in downtown Miami that houses defendants awaiting trial for the county's most serious offenses. Within hours of his booking, news of Jacob Miller's arrest had spread throughout Miami's media landscape, with helicopter footage of him being led into the facility in handcuffs appearing on all local stations. State Attorney Madison Jenkins held a brief press conference outside the detention center confirming the charges against Miller and emphasizing that her office would be seeking the death penalty based on the particularly heinous nature of the crimes and the special circumstances of killing for financial gain. The systematic murder of one's entire family for insurance money represents the most extreme betrayal of trust imaginable, Jenkins told the assembled reporters, the Miami skyline creating a dramatic backdrop as the evening sun cast long shadows across the detention center's facade. Inside the jail, Jacob was placed on suicide watch, standard procedure for high-profile murder defendants, particularly those facing capital charges. Corrections officers noted his apparent lack of emotion during intake procedures, with one officer reporting that Jacob seemed more concerned about access to commissary privileges than about the charges he was facing or the welfare of his surviving daughter. Most family murder suspects show either extreme emotion or complete dissociation, noted forensic psychologist Dr. James Whitaker, who would later evaluate Jacob for the court. Miller displayed a third pattern we sometimes see in particularly psychopathic individuals, an almost business-like approach to his circumstances, focused on practical matters like jail conditions rather than the moral weight of his actions or their consequences for others. While Jacob adjusted to life as a high-profile inmate, investigators continued building their case, executing additional search warrants for his storage unit, email accounts, and phone records. These searches yielded crucial evidence that would feature prominently at trial, a notebook containing what prosecutors called Jacob's murder checklist, with entries including make sure Emma doesn't wake up and wait 45-60 min before calling 911, alongside calculations of insurance payouts and estimated probate timelines. Email exchanges with insurance agents showed that Jacob had specifically inquired about policy provisions regarding accidental death and violent crime, ensuring that each family member's policy included double indemnity clauses that would maximize payouts under precisely the circumstances he was planning to create. Perhaps most chilling was a series of deleted text messages recovered from Jacob's phone, exchanged with a girlfriend in Tampa, whom investigators had not previously identified. These messages, sent in the weeks before the murders, revealed Jacob discussing future plans to move to Florida's Gulf Coast with a lot of money coming my way soon, and referring to his family as anchors holding him back from the life he wanted. After next month, it'll just be you and me and a few million reasons to be happy, he had written just 3 days before the murders, a message that Prosecutor Jenkins would later highlight as evidence of not just financial motivation, but also a desire to escape his family obligations for a new life he had been planning while still presenting himself as a devoted husband and father. When confronted with this new evidence during a follow-up interrogation requested by his attorney as part of preliminary plea negotiations, Jacob finally abandoned his intruder story, though his admissions came with significant minimization and justification rather than genuine remorse. Things just got out of control, he claimed, suggesting that financial pressure had caused a temporary break from reality, rather than acknowledging the weeks of planning documented in his own records. He admitted to killing Sarah after an argument about finances, claiming the deaths of the children were not premeditated but occurred when they witnessed their mother's murder, a narrative thoroughly contradicted by the crime scene evidence showing the children had been attacked in their beds with no signs of having been awakened before the fatal wounds were inflicted. Most significantly, Jacob offered an explanation for Emma's survival that aligned with the evidence while attempting to paint himself in a marginally better light. I couldn't go through with it when I got to her room, he claimed, describing a moment of hesitation that was interrupted by the neighbor's phone call. This partial confession, while confirming Jacob's responsibility for the murders, strategically omitted the financial motivation in an apparent attempt to avoid the special circumstances that would solidify the capital nature of the charges. Detective Holland, recognizing this strategy, directly asked about the insurance policies and elaborate staging of the scene, questions that Jacob refused to answer on advice of counsel, effectively ending the second interrogation with a partial admission that nevertheless provided prosecutors with powerful evidence of his guilt while failing to generate any mitigating factors that might help his defense. As news of Jacob's partial confession spread through legal channels in Miami, Emma's grandparents, Robert and Patricia Gardner, were notified by victim advocates from the state attorney's office. Their primary concern remained Emma's well-being, particularly how learning of her father's admissions might affect her ongoing therapy and recovery. Emma has been making progress with Dr. Martinez, but she still experiences nightmares and anxiety, particularly regarding her father's claims that she was confused or lying, Patricia explained to the victim advocates. The Gardners had relocated temporarily from Chicago to care for Emma in a rented home north of Miami, creating a stable environment away from media attention while ensuring she could continue treatment with the trauma specialists who had been working with her since the immediate aftermath of the attacks. Dr. Martinez recommended that Emma be told about her father's admissions in a controlled therapeutic setting, framing the information as validation of her experiences rather than additional traumatic content. Emma had been carrying the emotional burden of being disbelieved by the person who had harmed her, a particularly damaging dynamic in parent-perpetrated trauma, the psychologist explained in court documents. During a carefully structured therapy session, Emma was informed that her father had acknowledged harming her mother and brothers, information she received with a complex mixture of validation and renewed grief. "Is Daddy sorry?" she asked Dr. Martinez, a heartbreaking question from a child still seeking some redemptive quality in a parent who had tried to kill her, revealing the profound attachment bonds that often persist even in cases of extreme abuse or betrayal. As the case against Jacob Miller solidified with his partial confession, Miami's legal community began speculating about potential trial strategies or plea agreements, though State Attorney Jenkins remained firm in her position that the premeditated murder of a mother and 2 children for financial gain warranted the maximum penalty available under Florida law. The Miami Herald ran an extensive investigative piece detailing Jacob's gambling activities throughout South Florida, revealing connections to underground gambling operations that operated just beyond the glittering facade of the city's legitimate entertainment venues. This reporting contextualized Jacob's financial desperation within Miami's particular ecology of legal and illegal gambling, where the city's reputation as a playground for tourists and the wealthy created ample opportunities for addiction to take hold and spiral out of control. The final weeks before trial were marked by a series of defense motions seeking to exclude various pieces of evidence, particularly Jacob's partial confession and the financial records establishing motive. Judge Maria Ramirez, a veteran of Miami-Dade's criminal courts with over 2 decades on the bench, systematically denied these motions, ruling that the confession had been properly obtained after Miranda warnings and that the financial evidence was directly relevant to establishing premeditation and motive. The defense's increasingly desperate legal maneuvers reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence against their client, with Jacob's own attorneys reportedly urging him to consider pleading guilty in exchange for life imprisonment rather than facing a trial that would likely end with a death sentence, advice that Jacob, maintaining the same self-destructive confidence that had led him to believe he could get away with murdering his family, repeatedly rejected. On April 4, 2022, nearly 10 months after the murders that had shocked Miami, the trial of Jacob Miller began in the Miami-Dade County Courthouse, a hulking, brutalist structure in downtown Miami that stands as a stark contrast to the Art Deco buildings and palm trees that define much of the city's architecture. The courthouse steps were crowded with media from across Florida and national news organizations, all jostling for position as the key participants arrived for what had become one of the most anticipated criminal trials in recent Miami history. Inside Courtroom 4B, Judge Maria Ramirez addressed the pool of potential jurors, emphasizing the gravity of the case they might be selected to decide, and the importance of setting aside any information they might have absorbed from the extensive media coverage. Your job, if selected, will be to consider only the evidence presented in this courtroom, not what you may have heard or read elsewhere, Judge Ramirez instructed, her tone reflecting the seriousness with which she approached a case involving the murder of 2 children and their mother. Jury selection lasted 5 days, an unusually thorough process reflecting the case's complexity and the potential for a death penalty sentence if Jacob was convicted. Prosecutors and defense attorneys questioned potential jurors about their views on capital punishment, their ability to evaluate testimony from a child witness, and whether they could separate emotional reactions from evidence-based deliberation in a case involving family violence. We weren't looking for jurors who wouldn't be moved by the tragic nature of this case, State Attorney Madison Jenkins later explained to reporters. We were looking for 12 people who could acknowledge the emotional weight of the evidence while still making their decision based on facts rather than feelings. The final jury comprised 7 women and 5 men from diverse backgrounds across Miami-Dade County, including a retired teacher, a hospital administrator, a construction foreman, and a university student, with 4 alternates selected to ensure that any unforeseen circumstances would not derail the proceedings. The trial opened with Madison Jenkins delivering a methodical opening statement that laid out the state's case like the seasoned prosecutor she was, her measured tone contrasting with the horrific details she presented to the newly empaneled jury. On June 18, 2021, the defendant, Jacob Miller, executed a plan he had been developing for months to murder his entire family, collect over $3 million in life insurance, and start a new life with his girlfriend, Jenkins began, standing directly in front of the jury box in the wood-paneled courtroom. Using a large screen to display a family photograph of Sarah, Timothy, Nathan, and Emma, taken just weeks before the murders, Jenkins established the human stakes of the case before transitioning to the clinical precision with which Jacob had planned and carried out the attacks. The evidence will show that the defendant moved methodically from room to room in the family home, starting with his wife Sarah, then his sons Timothy and Nathan, and finally his daughter Emma. A systematic execution interrupted only by a coincidental phone call that saved Emma's life and ultimately exposed the defendant's elaborate deception. Defense attorney Michael Rodriguez, appointed by the court after Jacob's private funds were frozen pending the insurance fraud investigation, faced the unenviable task of presenting an opening statement for a client against whom the evidence was overwhelming. Rodriguez opted for a strategy focusing on Jacob's mental state rather than disputing the acts themselves, suggesting that years of undiagnosed depression and gambling addiction had created a perfect storm that resulted in a temporary break from reality. This case is not about what happened, but why it happened, and whether Jacob Miller's mental state at the time meets the legal definition of premeditated murder, Rodriguez told the jury, his Miami accent thick as he paced before them. This strategy attempted to thread a narrow needle, acknowledging Jacob's responsibility for the deaths while arguing against the premeditation that would support capital charges, a position undermined by the mountain of evidence showing weeks of planning and financial motivation. The prosecution's case began with testimony from first responders who had arrived at the Miller home on the night of June 18th, their accounts establishing the initial crime scene and Jacob's behavior in those critical first hours. Paramedic Javier Mendez described finding Emma barely conscious with multiple stab wounds, while Jacob appeared unusually focused on what we were doing and what we were saying, rather than being emotionally overwhelmed as we typically see in parents during pediatric emergencies. Body camera footage from Officer Daniela Cruz, the first police officer to enter the home, showed the bloody scene intact before evidence collection began, with Sarah and the boys' bodies visible enough to establish the violence of the attacks, while Judge Ramirez had ordered certain images redacted to prevent unnecessary trauma to the gallery and eventual media audience. Forensic evidence dominated the first week of trial, with Miami-Dade crime lab technicians testifying about blood spatter patterns, DNA results from the murder weapon and Jacob's hidden clothing, and the reconstruction of the sequence of attacks based on physical evidence. Most damning was the testimony of blood spatter analyst Carlos Vega, who used digital reconstructions to demonstrate that the evidence conclusively disproved Jacob's initial claim of interrupting an attack in progress. The blood spatter patterns throughout the home tell a clear story, Vega explained, using laser pointers on projected crime scene photographs. The perpetrator moved from the master bedroom to the boys' room, then to Emma's room, with no evidence of the chaotic struggle Mr. Miller initially described. Medical examiner Dr. Eliana Fernandez followed with testimony about the victim's wounds, clinically detailing how Sarah and both boys had defensive injuries, indicating they had awakened and attempted to protect themselves, their final moments marked by the terror of recognizing their attacker as husband and father. The financial motive took center stage during the second week, with prosecutors methodically building a picture of Jacob's escalating gambling addiction and financial desperation. Bank records displayed on courtroom screens showed his declining income from trucking jobs alongside increasing cash withdrawals at locations near gambling establishments, while credit card statements revealed cash advances taken at casino ATMs throughout South Florida. Financial investigator Rafael Moreno walked the jury through the insurance policies Jacob had taken out on his family, highlighting how he had specifically selected options that would maximize payouts for violent deaths while concealing these policy changes from Sarah. These weren't routine family insurance policies, Moreno testified, pointing to policy language that Jacob had highlighted in recovered documents. These were instruments designed to provide the maximum possible payout under exactly the circumstances the defendant created. Perhaps the most uncomfortable moment for the defense came when prosecutors displayed Jacob's browser history on the courtroom screens, showing searches including how to make murder look like home invasion, knife wounds, fatal versus non-fatal, and how long for life insurance to pay after murder. Digital forensics expert Lisa Chen explained how these searches, conducted in the weeks before the murders, had been discovered on the family computer despite Jacob's attempts to delete his browsing history. The defendant conducted these searches when his wife was at client meetings and the children were at school, deliberately timing his research to avoid detection by family members, Chen testified, further undermining the defense's claim that the murders resulted from a momentary break rather than calculated planning. The emotional center of the prosecution's case came midway through the trial with the presentation of Emma Miller's recorded testimony, taken months earlier in a comfortable setting designed to minimize additional trauma to the child. The courtroom fell silent as the video began playing on the large screen, showing Emma seated in a room decorated with children's artwork, a therapy dog by her side, as she responded to gentle questioning from forensic interviewer Vanessa Torres. Emma's account of the night of June 18th unfolded in the sometimes fragmented way typical of a traumatized child, but with key details that aligned perfectly with the forensic evidence. Hearing strange sounds from her brother's room, seeing her father enter her bedroom with the kitchen knife already covered in blood, and his instruction in the ambulance to blame an intruder or they would take me away forever. The jury watched with visible emotion as Emma described her confusion and fear in the days following the attack, believing she needed to protect her father even as she began to understand the magnitude of what had happened. "I didn't want to get Daddy in trouble," she explained in the video, her voice small but clear. "But then I kept having bad dreams about Mommy and Timmy and Nathan, and I knew they would want me to tell the truth." Several jurors wiped away tears as Emma recounted the moment in the hospital when she finally told Detective Holland what had really happened, her description of the weight lifting from her shoulders reflecting an emotional maturity beyond her years. Defense attorney Rodriguez declined to cross-examine this testimony via follow-up video recording, a strategic decision acknowledging that challenging Emma's account would likely only further alienate the jury. The prosecution's case continued with testimony from Emma's psychologist, Dr. Sofia Martinez, who explained the psychological dynamics that had initially led Emma to protect her father despite his attempt to kill her. Children have profound attachment bonds to their parents that can persist even in the face of extreme abuse or betrayal, Dr. Martinez testified, providing context for Emma's delayed disclosure. Emma's initial adherence to her father's story about an intruder wasn't evidence of confusion or fabrication. It was a traumatized child attempting to preserve her relationship with her only remaining parent, a common response in cases of family violence. This testimony preemptively addressed the defense's earlier suggestions that Emma's memories might be unreliable, establishing that her gradual disclosure process was entirely consistent with the established patterns in child trauma research. As the prosecution's case neared its conclusion, Detective Zachary Holland took the stand for what would become 2 full days of testimony, walking the jury through the investigation from the initial crime scene to Jacob's eventual arrest. Holland's testimony integrated the various strands of evidence, forensic, financial, and testimonial, into a comprehensive narrative of Jacob's plan to murder his family for insurance money and his elaborate but ultimately failed attempt to stage the killings as a home invasion. The detective's matter-of-fact delivery, honed through years of testifying in Miami's homicide cases, lent additional credibility to the prosecution's case, particularly when he described the inconsistencies in Jacob's behavior that had raised initial suspicions before any forensic results were available. The final prosecution witness was Jacob's previously unknown girlfriend, Melissa Donovan, who had been located in Tampa during the investigation and who testified about Jacob's promises of a new life together after he took care of some things in Miami. Visibly uncomfortable on the stand, Donovan described how Jacob had discussed moving in with her in July 2021 with plenty of money to start fresh, never mentioning that this timeline and sudden wealth would coincide with the deaths of his entire family. "He told me his wife didn't understand him, that his life in Miami was suffocating him," Donovan testified, avoiding eye contact with Jacob at the defense table. "I never imagined he meant this. I thought he was planning a divorce." This testimony, establishing an additional motive beyond financial gain, visibly impacted the jury, with several members glancing toward Jacob with undisguised contempt as Donovan described their relationship conducted through Jacob's frequent trips to Tampa, ostensibly for trucking jobs. Madison Jenkins concluded the state's case by recalling the medical examiner to present Emma's hospital records, documenting the extent of her injuries and the multiple surgeries required to save her life. Emma Miller survived 5 stab wounds to her chest and abdomen, Dr. Fernandez testified, displaying medical diagrams rather than actual photographs out of respect for Emma's privacy and ongoing recovery. Had the neighbor's phone call not interrupted the attack, or had emergency response been delayed by even 15 minutes, she would have become the 4th victim of her father's plan. With this final piece of evidence establishing both the severity of Jacob's attack on Emma and the interrupted nature of his plan, the prosecution rested its case, having presented nearly 3 weeks of testimony and over 200 exhibits documenting one of the most comprehensively investigated murder cases in Miami-Dade's recent history. The defense case began on April 25, 2022, with attorney Michael Rodriguez facing the nearly impossible task of countering the mountain of evidence presented by the prosecution. With Jacob Miller's guilt effectively established, even in the defense's opening statement, Rodriguez focused his case on attempting to mitigate the charges from first-degree premeditated murder, which could result in the death penalty to second-degree murder, by arguing diminished capacity due to gambling addiction and undiagnosed mental health issues. Our goal isn't to dispute what happened, but to help the jury understand the mental state that led to this tragedy, Rodriguez explained to reporters during a courthouse recess. His strategy, a tacit acknowledgement that complete acquittal was impossible, given the evidence. The defense's first witness was Dr. Lawrence Kessler, a psychiatrist specializing in gambling addiction, who testified about the profound cognitive and emotional impacts of severe gambling disorder, characterizing it as an addiction that can distort thinking as powerfully as any chemical dependency. Dr. Kessler reviewed Jacob's gambling history, noting patterns consistent with progressive addiction: increasing bet sizes, chasing losses, failed attempts to stop, and ultimately turning to criminal behavior to fund the addiction. Mr. Miller exhibits the classic progression we see in severe cases, where the addiction eventually consumes all rational thought and moral boundaries, Kessler testified, attempting to establish a foundation for the defense's diminished capacity argument. However, this testimony began to unravel during Madison Jenkins' cross-examination, as the prosecutor methodically walked Dr. Kessler through the evidence of Jacob's methodical planning, including his research into how police investigate staged crime scenes and the calculated increases in life insurance coverage. Doctor, would you agree that the ability to research, plan, and execute a complex criminal scheme over many weeks demonstrates intact cognitive function rather than impulse-driven behavior? Jenkins asked, leading Dr. Kessler to reluctantly acknowledge that Jacob's actions showed significant premeditation inconsistent with a pure impulse control disorder. The defense called several character witnesses who had known Jacob before his gambling addiction escalated, including former trucking colleagues and neighbors from the years before the Millers moved to Miami. These witnesses described Jacob as previously reliable and seemingly devoted to his family, expressing shock at the crimes for which he now stood trial. The Jacob I knew would never have hurt his kids. Something must have happened to change him, testified Robert Palmer, who had worked alongside Jacob at a trucking company in Georgia before the Millers relocated to Florida. This testimony aimed to establish Jacob as someone who had fundamentally changed due to addiction, rather than being inherently violent or calculating, a narrative that Jenkins systematically dismantled on cross-examination by having each character witness confirm they had no knowledge of Jacob's activities or mental state in the months leading up to the murders. The centerpiece of the defense case was the testimony of forensic psychologist Dr. James Whitaker, who had conducted extensive evaluations of Jacob while he was held at the Miami-Dade Pretrial Detention Center. Dr. Whitaker presented his conclusion that Jacob suffered from major depressive disorder and gambling disorder, conditions that he claimed had severely impaired Miller's judgment and ability to consider consequences at the time of the murders. Using brain scans and psychological test results displayed on courtroom screens, Whitaker attempted to establish that Jacob's conditions had created a perfect storm of impaired impulse control and catastrophic thinking. While Mr. Miller understood the nature of his actions, his ability to conform his conduct to the law was significantly compromised by his psychiatric conditions, Whitaker testified, directly addressing the legal standard for diminished capacity under Florida law. Madison Jenkins's cross-examination of Dr. Whitaker became a master class in prosecutorial technique, as she systematically exposed the contradictions between the psychologist's conclusions and the evidence of Jacob's methodical planning. "Doctor, you've testified that Mr. Miller's impulse control was severely compromised, yet the evidence shows he researched methods for staging crime scenes weeks before the murders. How do you reconcile these facts?" Jenkins asked, her tone measured but relentless. Whitaker's attempts to explain this discrepancy proved unconvincing, particularly when Jenkins displayed timeline evidence showing how Jacob had increased the family's insurance policies, researched fatal knife wounds, and even practiced his 911 call, actions spread over months that directly contradicted the defense's narrative of impulsive behavior driven by mental illness. In perhaps the most damaging exchange for the defense, Jenkins asked Dr. Whitaker about Jacob's decision to spare Emma's life, a critical point that the prosecution had framed as an interruption of his plan rather than a moral choice. If Mr. Miller was in the grip of an irresistible impulse when attacking his wife and sons, what changed when he entered Emma's room? Jenkins asked. Did his depression and gambling addiction suddenly pause when he reached his daughter's bedroom? Or is it more likely that the neighbor's phone call interrupted a fully premeditated plan that would have included Emma's death had circumstances not intervened? Whitaker's halting response, suggesting that Jacob might have experienced a moment of clarity that was coincidental to the phone call, appeared unconvincing to jurors, several of whom were observed taking detailed notes during this exchange. The defense case suffered another significant blow when prosecutors were permitted to cross-examine Dr. Whitaker about Jacob's partial confession, in which he had admitted to killing Sarah after an argument about finances and claimed the deaths of the children were not premeditated. "Doctor, are you aware that Mr. Miller's own account contradicts your testimony about impulsive behavior driven by mental illness?" Jenkins asked, displaying transcripts of Jacob's statements to investigators. He specifically stated that he killed his wife after a deliberate argument about finances, then realized the children would be witnesses and decided to kill them as well, actions that indicate rational, if horrific, decision-making rather than impulsive behavior. Whitaker's attempts to incorporate these admissions into his psychological assessment appeared increasingly strained, undermining the credibility of the defense's central argument about Jacob's mental state. Following 3 days of expert testimony that had largely backfired under cross-examination, the defense faced a critical decision about whether Jacob Miller should testify in his own defense. Legal analysts observing the trial from Miami's legal community speculated that Jacob's testimony represented both significant risk and the only remaining hope for the defense to establish some form of mitigation. After lengthy consultations in the courthouse holding cells, Rodriguez informed Judge Ramirez that the defendant would indeed take the stand, a high-stakes gamble that reflected the desperate position in which the defense found itself after the prosecution's overwhelming case and the ineffectiveness of their expert witnesses. Jacob Miller took the stand on the 4th day of the defense case, his appearance noticeably changed from the family photographs shown earlier in the trial. Now dressed in a court-issued suit rather than jail attire, with hair grown longer and a pallor acquired from months in detention, Jacob presented himself as remorseful and confused about his own actions. Under Rodriguez's careful questioning, Jacob admitted to killing Sarah during what he characterized as a heated argument about finances that spiraled out of control, then claimed he had panicked when he realized the boys had witnessed the attack, leading to their deaths as well. This narrative directly contradicted the forensic evidence showing the children had been attacked in their beds, but aligned with the defense strategy of portraying the murders as unplanned acts rather than the calculated execution described by prosecutors. When Rodriguez asked about Emma, Jacob claimed that seeing his daughter asleep in her bed had triggered a moment of clarity that was interrupted by the neighbor's phone call. I couldn't go through with it when I got to Emma, he testified, tears appearing for the first time during the trial. I was standing there with the knife, and suddenly I realized what I was doing. But then the phone rang, and I panicked. This testimony attempted to reframe his attack on Emma as incomplete due to moral awakening rather than external interruption, a narrative that Madison Jenkins was visibly eager to challenge as she prepared her notes for cross-examination. Jacob continued by expressing remorse and claiming that his gambling addiction had taken over my life, statements that seemed calculated to support the diminished capacity argument while avoiding the premeditation evidence that would sustain capital charges. Madison Jenkins's cross-examination of Jacob Miller became the defining moment of the trial as the experienced prosecutor methodically dismantled his narrative of impulsive violence and interrupted remorse. "Mr. Miller, you've testified that you killed Sarah during a sudden argument, but the medical examiner found that she was attacked while in bed, with no defensive wounds consistent with facing an attacker during an argument. How do you explain this discrepancy?" Jenkins began, establishing a pattern of confronting Jacob's testimony with contradictory physical evidence. Jacob's attempts to modify his story as each contradiction was exposed appeared increasingly desperate, with his earlier composure giving way to visible agitation as Jenkins methodically worked through the timeline of the murders, the financial evidence, and finally, his attack on Emma. The most powerful moment came when Jenkins displayed the notebook recovered from Jacob's storage unit, containing what prosecutors had called his murder checklist, with entries including "make sure Emma doesn't wake up" and "wait 45-60 minutes before calling 911," alongside calculations of insurance payouts. "Mr. Miller, you've testified that your attack on your family was unplanned, yet this notebook in your handwriting details exactly how you intended to kill all 4 family members, including Emma, and collect the insurance money. Was this also written during a momentary loss of control?" Jacob's response, a stammering claim that he didn't remember writing that, drew audible reactions from the gallery and visibly affected several jurors who had been taking detailed notes throughout his testimony. Jenkins concluded her devastating cross-examination by forcing Jacob to acknowledge each of the steps he had taken to prepare for the murders. Researching fatal stab wounds, increasing life insurance policies, studying how police investigate staged crime scenes, and practicing his 911 call, all actions spread over months that directly contradicted his testimony about impulsive violence. "Mr. Miller, isn't it true that rather than experiencing a moment of clarity when you saw Emma, you simply ran out of time when the phone call interrupted you before you could ensure she was dead?" Jenkins asked in her final question. Jacob's response, "I don't remember exactly what happened," effectively abandoned his earlier testimony about intentionally sparing Emma, leaving the jury with the clear impression that only chance had prevented him from completing his plan to murder his entire family for insurance money. Following Jacob's disastrous testimony, the defense case concluded with a brief psychiatric rebuttal attempt that failed to salvage their diminished capacity argument. Dr. Eliza Montgomery, a forensic psychiatrist called to address specific points raised during cross-examination, faced similar difficulties reconciling Jacob's methodical planning with the defense narrative of impaired judgment and impulse control. The evidence of extended planning and premeditation is difficult to reconcile with an impulse control disorder as the primary driver of these actions. Dr. Montgomery reluctantly acknowledged on cross-examination, effectively conceding the central point of contention in the case. With this final setback, defense attorney Rodriguez informed Judge Ramirez that the defense would rest its case, bringing the evidentiary phase of the trial to a close after nearly 4 weeks of testimony. Closing arguments were scheduled for May 2nd, giving both sides the weekend to prepare their final presentations to the jury. Madison Jenkins used this time to create a multimedia timeline that integrated the physical evidence, financial documentation, digital records, and testimony into a comprehensive narrative of Jacob's plan to murder his family for insurance money. We wanted to ensure that jurors could see how each piece of evidence fit into the larger pattern of premeditation, Jenkins explained to her trial team as they worked through the weekend in the state attorney's office. The Miami skyline visible through the windows as a storm system approached from the Atlantic, creating a dramatic backdrop that seemed to mirror the gravity of the case they were concluding. In the Miami-Dade Detention Center, Jacob Miller spent the weekend in consultation with his attorneys, the reality of his situation becoming increasingly apparent as they prepared him for the likelihood of conviction on all charges. At this point, our focus is on preserving issues for appeal and preparing for the penalty phase, Rodriguez explained to his client, referencing the separate proceeding that would determine sentencing if Jacob was found guilty of first-degree murder. Miami's legal observers, who had been following the trial closely in local media and legal publications, generally concurred that the defense had failed to establish any compelling alternative to the prosecution's narrative of calculated murder for financial gain, with several former prosecutors predicting a quick guilty verdict followed by lengthy deliberations on the question of the death penalty. On May 3, 2022, after nearly 5 weeks of testimony and evidence presentation, the fate of Jacob Miller was placed in the hands of the 12 jurors who had attentively followed every detail of the case. Judge Maria Ramirez delivered her instructions to the jury over the course of 2 hours, carefully explaining the legal elements of first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, and the lesser-included offenses that they could consider if they found the evidence insufficient for the most serious charges. You must determine whether the state has proven every element of each crime beyond a reasonable doubt, Judge Ramirez instructed, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. Your decision must be based solely on the evidence presented in this courtroom and the law, as I have explained it to you. As the jurors filed out to begin their deliberations, Jacob Miller sat impassively at the defense table, his expression unreadable as he faced the possibility of a death sentence for the murders of his wife and sons and the attempted murder of his daughter. The courthouse press room filled quickly with journalists from local and national media as deliberations began, with legal analysts offering predictions about the likely outcome based on the overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecution. This case featured some of the most comprehensive evidence of premeditation I've seen in 20 years of covering Miami's criminal courts, remarked veteran legal correspondent Maria Santana for Miami's WSVN News. The defense faced an uphill battle from the start, and Jacob's own testimony may have sealed his fate when he couldn't reconcile his claims of impulsive behavior with the mountain of evidence showing months of planning. As camera crews set up on the courthouse steps in anticipation of a verdict, the Miami skyline visible in the background, the city seemed to collectively hold its breath, awaiting the conclusion of a case that had shocked the community and become a topic of conversation from the exclusive enclaves of Key Biscayne to the working-class neighborhoods of Hialeah. To the surprise of many legal observers, the jury returned after just 4 hours and 17 minutes of deliberation, suggesting they had reached consensus quickly on the central questions of the case. As word spread that the jury was returning, the courtroom filled to capacity, with extra security posted at the doors and victims' advocates escorting Emma's grandparents, Robert and Patricia Gardner, to their reserved seats in the front row. Emma herself remained absent from the proceedings, continuing her therapy and education in the protective environment her grandparents had established, shielded from the media attention surrounding the trial. Judge Ramirez entered the courtroom and called for the jury, whose solemn expressions as they filed in gave no indication of their decision, but reflected the gravity with which they had approached their responsibility. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Ramirez asked, her voice cutting through the tense silence of the courtroom. "We have, Your Honor," replied the jury foreperson, a middle-aged hospital administrator who had taken meticulous notes throughout the trial. The clerk collected the verdict forms and delivered them to Judge Ramirez, who reviewed them silently before returning them for the foreperson to read. Jacob Miller was directed to stand alongside his attorneys as the verdict was announced, his previously impassive expression now showing the first signs of apprehension as the reality of the moment seemed to finally penetrate his calculated demeanor. The courtroom fell completely silent as the foreperson began to read. "On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Sarah Miller, we find the defendant, Jacob Miller, guilty as charged. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Timothy Miller, we find the defendant, Jacob Miller, guilty as charged. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Nathan Miller, we find the defendant, Jacob Miller, guilty as charged. On the charge of attempted first-degree murder of Emma Miller, we find the defendant, Jacob Miller, guilty as charged." Additional guilty verdicts followed for the charges of insurance fraud, tampering with evidence, and obstruction of justice, completing the state's comprehensive case against Jacob Miller. As the verdicts were read, Jacob visibly paled but remained standing without obvious emotion, while behind him Emma's grandparents embraced silently, tears streaming down their faces at this formal acknowledgment of the justice they had sought for their daughter and grandchildren. Judge Ramirez thanked the jury for their service and announced that the penalty phase of the trial would begin the following week, during which the same jury would hear additional evidence before determining whether Jacob Miller should receive life imprisonment or the death penalty for his crimes. Outside the courthouse, State Attorney Madison Jenkins addressed the assembled media, her measured tone reflecting the gravity of the case despite the successful prosecution. Today's verdict represents justice for Sarah, Timothy, and Nathan Miller, whose lives were taken in an act of unconscionable betrayal, Jenkins stated, Miami's afternoon sun casting harsh shadows across the courthouse steps. It also represents justice for Emma Miller, who has shown remarkable courage throughout this ordeal and who will now have the opportunity to heal, knowing that the truth has been officially acknowledged. Jenkins declined to comment on whether her office would pursue the death penalty with maximum vigor, stating only that we will present all relevant evidence during the penalty phase and respect whatever decision the jury reaches after considering that evidence. Defense attorney Michael Rodriguez made a brief statement following Jenkins, acknowledging the verdict while indicating that the defense would focus on presenting mitigating factors during the penalty phase. "We accept the jury's decision on the question of guilt," Rodriguez stated, his expression somber. "Our focus now turns to ensuring that the jury has a complete understanding of all factors that should influence their decision regarding appropriate punishment." This statement effectively signaled that the defense was pivoting entirely to saving Jacob's life rather than continuing to contest his responsibility for the murders, a strategic shift that legal analysts noted was virtually inevitable given the strength of the prosecution's case and the jury's quick decision on guilt. The reaction to the verdict extended far beyond the courtroom, with Miami's diverse communities following the case closely since the murders first made headlines nearly a year earlier. In the neighborhood where the Miller family had lived, residents expressed relief at the verdict while reflecting on the tragedy that had unfolded behind the closed doors of a seemingly normal home on their street. "We all thought they were just a regular family," remarked neighbor Claudia Morales, who had been interviewed frequently by local media due to her friendship with Sarah Miller. "It makes you wonder what might be happening in any house you pass, what secrets people might be hiding." This sentiment echoed throughout Miami's conversation about the case, with the Miller murders becoming a troubling symbol of the potential darkness concealed beneath normal appearances. For Emma Miller, news of the verdict came through carefully managed channels designed to support her ongoing recovery. Dr. Sophia Martinez, who continued to provide therapy for Emma several times weekly, worked with her grandparents to explain the jury's decision in age-appropriate terms that emphasized validation of Emma's experiences without burdening her with the legal complexities of the case. Emma's reaction included relief that she had been believed, but also renewed grief as the finality of the situation became more concrete for her, Dr. Martinez noted in case records later referenced during the penalty phase. She asked thoughtful questions about what would happen to her father now, showing the complex emotional attachment that often persists in cases of family violence, even when a child fully understands that what the parent did was wrong. The penalty phase of the trial began on May 10th, with prosecutors presenting evidence of aggravating factors that they argued warranted the death penalty under Florida law. State Attorney Jenkins methodically established the presence of multiple statutory aggravators. The murders were especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel. They were committed in a cold, calculated, and premeditated manner. They were committed for financial gain, and they involved the murder of children under the age of 12. Victim impact statements from Sarah's parents and siblings provided emotional testimony about the devastating impact of the murders, with Robert Gardner speaking directly to the jury about the challenges Emma now faced in recovering from both physical and psychological wounds inflicted by her father. Emma still has nightmares where she wakes up crying for her mother and brothers, Gardner testified, his voice breaking with emotion. She bears scars both visible on her body and invisible in her heart, wounds that may heal but will never completely disappear. This testimony, permitted under Florida law to give jurors insight into the full impact of the crime, visibly affected several jury members who had maintained stoic expressions throughout much of the main trial. Gardner's testimony was followed by a statement from Sarah's sister, who described the promising life cut short and the dreams Sarah had for her children's futures, dreams now possible only for Emma and forever denied to Timothy and Nathan. The defense presented mitigating factors during their portion of the penalty phase, focusing on Jacob's previously clean criminal record, his mental health and gambling addiction, and the potential impact of a death sentence on Emma's long-term recovery. While nothing can excuse what Jacob Miller did, we ask you to consider whether adding another death will help Emma heal or simply create another traumatic chapter in her young life, Rodriguez argued, attempting to frame life imprisonment as the more merciful option for the surviving victim. Mental health experts testified about treatment possibilities within the prison system, suggesting that Jacob could potentially come to a fuller understanding of his crimes and express genuine remorse with proper intervention, an argument undercut by his continued minimization of premeditation and his failure to express meaningful remorse throughout the trial. After 2 days of testimony and argument during the penalty phase, the jury retired to deliberate on Jacob Miller's sentence on the afternoon of May 12, 2022. Their decision would require careful weighing of the aggravating factors presented by the prosecution against the mitigating factors offered by the defense, with Florida law requiring a unanimous decision to impose the death penalty. As Miami's media continued intense coverage of the case, legal experts noted that the brutality of the crimes, combined with the clear financial motivation and the murder of children, created a strong case for capital punishment under Florida's sentencing guidelines. The defense faces significant challenges in this penalty phase, noted former prosecutor Elena Vasquez, commenting for local news. The aggravating factors in this case align precisely with those the Florida legislature identified as warranting the ultimate punishment. After 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their decision on sentencing, filing solemnly back into courtroom 4B, where Jacob Miller again stood with his attorneys awaiting his fate. Judge Ramirez instructed the defendant and all present that regardless of the jury's recommendation, final sentencing would occur at a later date after completion of a pre-sentence investigation, though Florida judges typically follow jury recommendations in capital cases. The foreperson handed the decision forms to the clerk, who passed them to Judge Ramirez for review before they were read aloud to the crowded courtroom. For the first-degree murder of Sarah Miller, the jury unanimously recommends that Jacob Miller be sentenced to death, read the clerk, her voice steady despite the weight of the words. For the first-degree murder of Timothy Miller, the jury unanimously recommends that Jacob Miller be sentenced to death. For the first-degree murder of Nathan Miller, the jury unanimously recommends that Jacob Miller be sentenced to death. Additional recommendations of life imprisonment for the attempted murder of Emma and maximum sentences for the remaining charges completed the jury's decision, effectively ensuring that Jacob Miller would never again be free, regardless of potential appeals of the death sentences. Jacob showed little visible reaction to the death recommendations, his face maintaining the same mask-like quality it had held throughout much of the trial, a final demonstration of the emotional disconnect that had allowed him to plan and execute the murders of his family for financial gain. Judge Ramirez thanked the jury for their service through both phases of the difficult trial and set a formal sentencing date for June 24th, allowing time for completion of the required pre-sentence investigation. As news of the death recommendation spread through Miami and across national media, public reaction reflected the horror the case had inspired since the murders first came to light. The jury's decision sends a clear message that the calculated murder of children for financial gain represents the most extreme violation of our community's moral standards, State Attorney Jenkins told reporters gathered outside the courthouse. While no outcome can restore what was lost, we hope this result provides some measure of closure for Emma and the extended family who continue to support her recovery. Defense Attorney Rodriguez indicated that appeals would be filed based on several objections raised during trial, though legal analysts noted that given the overwhelming evidence and the careful management of the proceedings by Judge Ramirez, such appeals faced significant hurdles. For Emma Miller, now living with her grandparents in Chicago, following the conclusion of the trial, the news of her father's death sentence represented another complex emotional milestone in her ongoing recovery. Dr. Martinez, who continued to provide therapy through remote sessions, reported that Emma processed the information with a maturity beyond her years, asking thoughtful questions about what the sentence meant and how long it might be before it was carried out. Emma expressed concern about her father's well-being despite everything that happened, Dr. Martinez noted in a statement provided to victim advocates. This empathy, even toward someone who caused her such harm, speaks to her remarkable resilience and capacity for healing. Emma's grandparents continued to shield her from media attention while creating as normal a childhood as possible, enrolling her in a new school where her history wasn't widely known, and supporting her return to the artistic pursuits that had brought her joy before the tragedy. Miami's legal community generally viewed the outcome as appropriate given the nature of the crimes and the overwhelming evidence, though the case reignited ongoing debates about capital punishment that divided Floridians along familiar lines. Religious leaders, including priests from Miami's prominent Catholic community, issued statements calling for mercy and rehabilitation rather than retribution, while victims' rights advocates countered that the death penalty represented appropriate justice for crimes that had taken 3 lives and nearly claimed a 4th. The Miller case became a reference point in these discussions, with both sides citing different aspects of the tragedy to support their positions on whether the state should ever exercise the ultimate punishment, even in cases of extraordinary cruelty and calculation. As Jacob Miller was returned to the Miami-Dade Detention Center to await formal sentencing, The city that had been captivated by his trial began the process of moving forward, though the case had left an indelible mark on Miami's collective consciousness. Local schools implemented enhanced protocols for identifying children experiencing trauma or abuse at home, while domestic violence organizations reported increased donations and volunteer inquiries in the wake of the trial's conclusion. The Miller case, with its facade of normalcy concealing deadly calculation, served as a sobering reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers lie not in Miami's notorious criminal underworld, but behind the closed doors of seemingly ordinary homes in quiet neighborhoods, where the unthinkable can unfold beyond public view. On June 24, 2022, 1 year and 6 days after the murders that had shocked Miami and captured national attention, Jacob Miller returned to Courtroom 4B for formal sentencing before Judge Maria Ramirez. The courtroom was filled to capacity, with additional spectators watching via closed-circuit television in an overflow room, reflecting the profound impact the case had on the community. Emma's grandparents, Robert and Patricia Gardner, were present for the sentencing, having made the difficult decision to attend without Emma, who remained in Chicago continuing her education and therapy away from the media spotlight that still surrounded the case. Jacob Miller, now visibly thinner after a year in detention and dressed in a county-issued suit, rather than jail attire, showed little emotion as he was led into the courtroom by sheriff's deputies, his wrists and ankles shackled according to standard protocol for capital defendants. Judge Ramirez opened the proceedings by acknowledging the jury's recommendations and confirming that she had reviewed the comprehensive pre-sentence investigation report prepared by the Department of Corrections. Before pronouncing sentence, the court will hear any statements from victims or their representatives, as provided by Florida law, Ramirez announced, nodding toward the prosecution table where State Attorney Madison Jenkins rose to introduce Robert Gardner, who had requested the opportunity to address the court on behalf of his daughter Sarah and grandchildren. Gardner approached the podium slowly, carrying a framed family photograph that he placed on the ledge before him, visible to both the judge and to Jacob Miller, seated just feet away at the defense table. The image showed Sarah with her 3 children at Miami Beach, their smiles capturing a happiness that now existed only in memory and in the surviving spirit of young Emma. Your Honor, I speak today for my daughter Sarah, who can no longer speak for herself, and for my grandsons Timothy and Nathan, whose voices were silenced far too soon, Gardner began, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his expression. I also speak for Emma, who bears the physical and emotional scars of what happened, but who has shown remarkable courage throughout this ordeal. Gardner described the devastating impact of the murders on their extended family, the birthdays and holidays now marked by absence, and the milestones that Timothy and Nathan would never reach. He spoke of Sarah's talents and dreams, cut short at 39 by the husband she had trusted, and of Emma's ongoing journey of healing that would continue long after the legal proceedings concluded. We do not seek vengeance, Gardner stated, looking directly at Jacob. We seek justice and the assurance that he can never again harm Emma or anyone else. Following Gardner's statement, Jacob Miller was offered the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, a moment many in the courtroom had anticipated might provide some insight into his motivation or perhaps express genuine remorse. Miller rose slowly, his chains rattling in the otherwise silent courtroom, and delivered a statement that legal observers would later describe as remarkable for its continued self-focus rather than true contrition. I never intended things to happen this way, Miller began, offering what amounted to a passive acknowledgement rather than a direct admission of his actions. I was overwhelmed by financial pressure and made terrible choices that I can't explain or justify. His brief statement included no direct apology to Emma or to Sarah's family, focusing instead on his own mental state and the gambling addiction that his defense had unsuccessfully presented as mitigating his culpability. This final opportunity to express genuine remorse passed without Miller ever directly acknowledging the calculated nature of his crimes or the profound suffering he had caused, reinforcing the jury's assessment of his character and their recommendation for the maximum punishment. Judge Ramirez then delivered her sentencing decision, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom as she methodically addressed each charge. For the first-degree murder of Sarah Miller, this court sentences you to death in accordance with the jury's unanimous recommendation. Similar death sentences followed for the murders of Timothy and Nathan, with additional sentences of life imprisonment without possibility of parole for the attempted murder of Emma and maximum consecutive terms for the fraud and evidence tampering charges. The calculated nature of these crimes, committed against your own family for financial gain, represents the most extreme betrayal of trust this court has witnessed in over 2 decades on the bench, Ramirez stated, her typically measured judicial tone giving way to rare, explicit condemnation. The evidence presented at trial established beyond any doubt that you methodically planned to murder your entire family, including your 10-year-old daughter, for insurance money, a scheme interrupted only by chance, not by any moral awakening on your part. As the sentences were pronounced, Jacob Miller stood impassively, showing no more reaction to his fate than he had to the evidence of his crimes throughout the trial. Sheriff's deputies moved forward to escort him from the courtroom, following the formal pronouncement of sentence, with Miller's automatic appeal to the Florida Supreme Court already set in motion by the capital sentences. As he was led away, Robert and Patricia Gardner embraced, their expressions reflecting not triumph, but the somber acknowledgement that while justice had been served according to law, nothing could restore what had been taken from them or from Emma. State Attorney Jenkins approached them quietly as the courtroom began to empty, expressing both professional satisfaction with the outcome and personal sympathy for their ongoing grief, the human dimension that remained even after the legal process had reached its conclusion. Outside the courthouse, Jenkins addressed the assembled media, characterizing the sentencing as appropriate justice for crimes that represent the darkest spectrum of human behavior. She emphasized that while the death sentences would begin years of mandatory appeals, the life sentence for Emma's attempted murder ensured that Jacob Miller would never be free regardless of the outcome of those appeals. Today's sentences reflect the gravity of the defendant's actions and the community's rejection of violence against the most vulnerable among us, children who should be able to trust their parents absolutely, Jenkins stated, the Miami skyline behind her as. Afternoon thunderstorms gathered on the horizon, a typical summer weather pattern in the city that had been the setting for this extraordinary case. Jenkins specifically acknowledged the investigative work of Detective Zachary Holland and the Miami-Dade Police Department, whose methodical building of the case had provided the foundation for the successful prosecution. For Emma Miller, now living in Chicago with her grandparents and attending a new school where she was known simply as a new student rather than a survivor of a horrific crime, news of her father's formal sentencing came through carefully managed channels designed to support her ongoing recovery. Dr. Sophia Martinez, who continued to provide therapy through both in-person visits and secure video sessions, worked with Robert and Patricia to explain the outcome in age-appropriate terms that emphasized Emma's safety while acknowledging the complex emotions she might experience about her father's fate. Emma's psychological healing involves integrating the trauma she experienced while rebuilding her sense of security and trust, Dr. Martinez explained in a statement released through the Victims Advocacy organization that had supported the family throughout the legal proceedings. She continues to show remarkable resilience while processing grief for her mother and brothers, alongside the complicated feelings about her father that are natural for a child in her situation. Emma's physical recovery had progressed significantly in the year following the attack, though she continued to bear scars from the 5 stab wounds that had nearly claimed her life. Her psychological recovery followed a less linear path, with progress marked by both remarkable resilience and inevitable setbacks triggered by memories or anniversaries. Emma has begun to speak more freely about her mother and brothers, sharing memories and keeping their presence alive in ways that promote healthy grief processing, reported her Chicago-based therapist, who worked in consultation with Dr. Martinez to provide continuity of care. Art therapy remained a crucial outlet for Emma's emotional expression, with her drawings evolving from the dark, fragmented images created immediately after the trauma to more integrated representations of her memories and current experiences, a visual record of her healing journey that therapists noted was common among child survivors of extreme trauma. In Miami, the impact of the Miller case extended far beyond the courthouse, influencing both institutional policies and public awareness regarding family violence and financial exploitation. The Miami-Dade School District implemented enhanced training for teachers and counselors to identify signs of potential abuse or family distress, while local hospitals developed improved protocols for evaluating children whose injuries might indicate domestic violence. The Miller case highlighted how even seemingly functional families can conceal dangerous dynamics, explained Dr. Elena Vasquez, director of Miami Children's Hospital's Child Protection Team, who had been consulted during Emma's initial treatment. It reminded us that listening carefully to children and being alert to behavioral cues that might contradict an adult's explanation for injuries are essential components of protecting vulnerable young patients. The financial aspects of the case also generated institutional responses, with Florida insurance regulators reviewing policies regarding high-value life insurance on dependents and implementing new algorithms to flag potential fraud indicators similar to those present in Jacob Miller's insurance applications. While we cannot prevent all insurance-motivated crimes, we can create systems that identify suspicious patterns for further investigation, stated Florida Insurance Commissioner Rafael Dominguez during legislative hearings prompted in part by the Miller case. These regulatory changes, though technical in nature, represented one concrete legacy of a tragedy that had exposed vulnerabilities in existing systems designed to protect families and detect potential exploitation of insurance markets for criminal purposes. The media narrative surrounding the case gradually shifted from sensationalized accounts of the murders themselves to more thoughtful exploration of the factors that had allowed Jacob Miller's deadly plan to develop undetected. Documentary filmmakers approached the case with varying degrees of sensitivity, some focusing on the procedural aspects of the investigation, while others used it as a starting point for broader examination of family annihilation cases across the country. Sarah's parents declined most media requests, prioritizing Emma's privacy and recovery over potential public education benefits, though they did provide input to a respected public television documentary that focused primarily on the systemic issues revealed by the case rather than exploiting the graphic details that had dominated earlier coverage. 1 year after Jacob Miller's sentencing, on the second anniversary of the murders, a small memorial garden was dedicated at a Miami community center where Sarah had occasionally volunteered her graphic design services. The garden, featuring native Florida plants and 3 royal palm trees representing Sarah, Timothy, and Nathan, offered a peaceful space for reflection while deliberately avoiding creating a spectacle at the actual crime scene, which had been sold and renovated by new owners unconnected to the case. The dedication ceremony, attended by friends of the family and community members who had been moved by their story, included artwork created by Emma and sent from Chicago. a painting of butterflies and flowers that represented her ongoing connection to her mother and brothers without directly depicting their images, a therapeutic approach suggested by her art therapist to balance remembrance with forward movement in her healing journey. On Florida's death row at Union Correctional Institution, Jacob Miller began the lengthy appeals process, automatic in capital cases, his daily existence now confined to a 6 by 9 foot cell for 23 hours per day. A stark contrast to the freedom he had hoped to purchase through his family's murders. His court-appointed appellate attorneys filed the standard motions challenging various aspects of the trial, though legal experts noted that Judge Ramirez's careful management of the proceedings had left few substantive issues for appeal. Miller's case joined dozens of others in Florida's capital punishment system, where the average time between sentencing and execution exceeds 15 years due to the mandatory appeals process and frequent litigation surrounding the state's execution protocols. This extended timeline meant that Emma would likely be an adult before any final resolution of her father's case, a reality that her therapists and grandparents acknowledged in age-appropriate discussions about the justice system. Emma's long-term prognosis reflected both the severe trauma she had experienced and the extraordinary support system that had developed around her. Child trauma experts noted that while she would likely always carry the psychological impact of what had happened, early and consistent therapeutic intervention, combined with the stable and loving environment provided by her grandparents, offered the best possible foundation for eventual post-traumatic growth. Emma's case reminds us that children can survive unimaginable trauma and still develop into healthy, functioning adults when provided with appropriate support, noted Dr. James Whitaker, a national expert on childhood trauma who had reviewed Emma's case as part of a broader study on resilience factors in child survivors of family violence. Her journey is both unique in its specifics and representative of the capacity for healing that exists even after extreme betrayal and loss. As Miami moved forward, the Miller case remained in the community's collective memory, occasionally referenced in discussions of domestic violence, financial crime, or the justice system, but gradually receding from daily conversation as new cases and concerns captured public attention. For those directly involved in the investigation and prosecution, however, the impact remained profound. Detective Zachary Holland, who had led the investigation from its first hours, acknowledged in a rare interview that the case had affected him more deeply than most in his long career. "What stays with me is Emma's courage," Holland explained, how a 10-year-old girl found the strength to eventually tell the truth despite her father's manipulation and her own understandable confusion about loyalties. State Attorney Madison Jenkins similarly cited the case as among the most significant of her career, not only for its legal complexity, but for the weight of responsibility she had felt toward ensuring justice for Sarah, Timothy, Nathan, and especially for Emma, who would live with the consequences of Jacob's actions long after the legal proceedings concluded. The final legacy of the Miller case perhaps belonged most properly to Emma herself, who in the years following the tragedy gradually reclaimed her identity beyond that of victim or survivor. As she entered adolescence in the home her grandparents had created for her in Chicago, Emma began participating in a carefully supervised peer support group for children who had experienced family trauma, eventually expressing interest in someday helping others as she had been helped. Her artistic talents, nurtured by both her mother before the tragedy and by the therapists and teachers who supported her afterward, continued to develop as an outlet for both expression and potential future career interests. Emma's journey from the traumatized child who had whispered, "You stabbed me," to her father in a Miami hospital room, to the gradually healing young person finding her path forward in a new city, embodied both the profound damage family violence inflicts and the resilience of the human spirit when supported by justice, therapy, and unconditional love. Miami, a city often defined in popular culture by its glamour and occasional excess, found in the Miller case a somber reminder that beneath the surface of ordinary lives, extraordinary darkness can sometimes lurk, and that the most dangerous threats may come not from strangers, but from those entrusted with our greatest vulnerability. The case entered the city's complicated history alongside the drug violence of the 1980s, the celebrity scandals of South Beach, and the corruption cases that occasionally rocked local government, distinct in its domestic nature, but equally reflective of the human capacity for both terrible harm and remarkable healing that exists in every community, regardless of climate, culture, or geography. As Miami continued its perpetual reinvention under the tropical sun, the lessons of the Miller case remained: that vigilance, compassion, and justice are necessary components of any community that seeks to protect its most vulnerable members from those who should be their greatest protectors.